You probably noticed a slight draft coming from your window this morning. Maybe you felt that tiny, sharp prick of cold air on your neck while you were making coffee, and you made a mental note to call someone about the weather stripping. Or perhaps you stepped out of the shower, and the floor was just a little too chilly for your bare feet, causing you to dance quickly toward the rug. It's a small thing, a minor inconvenience in a life designed around climate control. We spend our days in a series of temperature-regulated boxes, moving from a heated house to a heated car to a heated office, treating the actual environment outside as a brief transition we have to endure. But that tiny draft you felt is actually a ghost. It's a whisper from a version of the world that tried to kill every single one of your ancestors for 100,000 years straight. We are, quite literally, tropical animals. We are hairless, thin-skinned, and we lose heat at an alarming rate. If you took a map of the world and highlighted the places where a naked human could survive a single January night without technology, you'd be looking at a very small sliver of the equator. Yet here we are, living in places where the air can turn your lungs to ice in minutes. That shouldn't be possible. We are essentially shaved monkeys who decided to pick a fight with the Arctic and somehow won. The math of our survival doesn't add up. If you look at a polar bear or a musk ox, you see an animal that was built by the cold. They have layers of hollow hair, thick blankets of subcutaneous fat, and specialized circulatory systems that keep their core warm while their extremities stay just above freezing. They are biological fortresses. Humans, by comparison, are more like a leaky tent. We don't have a winter coat. We don't hibernate. We can't even store much internal fuel. We are high-maintenance machines that require a constant, massive intake of calories just to keep our internal thermostat at 98.6 degrees. During the last glacial maximum, about 21,000 years ago, the world was a very different place. Massive ice sheets, some of them 2 miles thick, crawled across North America and Europe. The temperate zones we live in today were essentially frozen tundras, blasted by winds that could strip the skin off your face. And yet, archaeological sites like Sungir in Russia or Mezhyrik in Ukraine show us that humans weren't just barely surviving in these places. They were thriving. They were making art, wearing jewelry, and building complex societies in the middle of a literal ice age. To understand how they did it, we have to look past the primitive label we usually give them. These weren't just people with spears. They were the most sophisticated engineers the world had ever seen up to that point. They didn't just find heat. They invented it. It started with the skin. For a long time, researchers thought ancient humans just draped loose animal furs over their shoulders like heavy blankets. If you've ever tried to stay warm in a drafty house with just a loose throw rug, you know that doesn't work for long. The moment you move, the heat escapes. The moment the wind blows, it cuts right through the gaps. To survive a real winter, you need an airtight seal. This is where one of the most important inventions in the history of our species comes in, the bone needle. It sounds small, but the needle changed everything. Around 30 to 40,000 years ago, we see these tiny, delicate tools appearing in the fossil record, made from mammoth ivory or bird bone. They weren't just for decoration. They meant we could sew. We moved from wearing a skin to wearing a garment. Archaeologist Ian Gilligan has done some incredible work on this, distinguishing between simple clothing, which is just draped, and complex clothing, which is fitted to the body. Fitted clothing creates a microclimate. It traps a layer of air against your skin and holds it there. If you look at the Sungir site in Russia, which dates back about 30,000 years, the burials there are mind-blowing. The people were buried in outfits covered in thousands of hand-carved ivory beads, but the way those beads are positioned tells us they were sewn onto fitted trousers, shirts, and even boots. They had hoods that closed tight around the face and cuffs that sealed the wrists. They were essentially wearing the prehistoric version of a high-tech parka. They understood that the secret to survival wasn't just having fur, it was having a seal. The wind was the real enemy. You can have the best coat in the world, but if the wind hits your face at 40 miles per hour in sub-zero temperatures, you're still in trouble. Ancient hunters in the far north developed a trick that sounds a bit grisly to us today, but it was a literal lifesaver. They would take animal fat, or tallow, and rub it in a thick layer over their exposed skin, their faces, their necks, their hands. If you've ever put on a heavy petroleum-based moisturizer, you've felt a tiny version of this. The fat acts as a physical barrier. It stops the moisture in your skin from evaporating, which is one of the fastest ways to lose heat, and it creates a windproof shield. But even with fat and fur, the eyes were a problem. The sun reflecting off a vast white landscape of snow can cause snow blindness, a painful condition where the UV rays actually burn your corneas. To fix this, ancient people carved small, thin slits into pieces of bone or wood and tied them over their eyes. These were the world's first sunglasses. They didn't just protect the eyes from the glare, they also helped the hunters focus their vision, almost like a camera aperture, making it easier to spot movement on the horizon. It was a complete kit. From the fat on their skin to the bone on their eyes, they had engineered a way to turn a tropical body into an Arctic one. But you can't stay outside forever. Eventually, you have to go home. But home during the Ice Age wasn't always a cave. Hollywood has taught us to call them cavemen, but the reality is that caves are actually pretty rare, and they're often in the wrong places for hunting. If you were living on the Great Steppe of what is now Ukraine or Russia 20,000 years ago, there were no caves for hundreds of miles. There were also no trees. The landscape was a flat, frozen sea of grass. So if you don't have wood for a frame and you don't have stone for a wall, what do you build with? You build with the only thing that's big enough and strong enough to stand up to a blizzard: the bones of giants. Sites like Mezherik are home to some of the most spectacular architecture in human history. These were houses made entirely of mammoth bones. We're talking about massive circular structures where the foundations were made of mammoth skulls and jawbones stacked like bricks. The walls were braced with huge leg bones, and the roofs were framed with interlocked tusks, probably covered in heavy hides and then weighted down with more bones. A single house might use the remains of 95 different mammoths. These weren't just piles of bones either. They were organized. They had designated areas for sleeping, for tool-making, and for fire. And the design was brilliant. Many of these dwellings featured a cold trap entrance. The doorway was dug lower than the living floor, so the heavy, cold air would sink into the entrance pit and stay there, while the warm air stayed trapped in the higher living area. It's the same principle used in modern igloos, and it's remarkably effective. You could have a howling gale outside at -40, and inside that mammoth bone dome, a small fire and a few bodies would keep the temperature quite comfortable. The walls were made of giants, but the fuel was inside them. Staying warm is a high-energy game. You need fire and you need food, but in a world with no trees, fire is hard to come by. You can't just go out and gather kindling when there isn't a twig for miles. So, our ancestors became masters of alternative fuels. They would burn dried animal dung, which actually burns quite hot and slow, but their real secret weapon was bone marrow and fat. Bone itself doesn't burn well, but if you break a mammoth bone open and use the fatty marrow inside, or if you render down animal fat into tallow, you have a high-energy fuel that can stay lit for a long time. They even created small stone lamps, using a piece of moss as a wick sitting in a pool of animal grease. These lamps didn't just provide light. They provided a small, constant source of heat that didn't produce the choking smoke of a large wood fire. This allowed them to keep their shelters sealed up tight, which is crucial for heat retention. They were essentially living inside a giant fur-lined thermos, heated by the fat of the animals they hunted. Hunger is a clock that ticks faster in the cold. When the temperature drops, your body starts burning through its glycogen stores just to keep your heart beating. In a modern winter, we just walk to the fridge. In the Pleistocene, the fridge was the entire world, but it was often empty. To survive, you had to be a master of logistics. You couldn't just hunt when you were hungry. You had to hunt when the opportunity arose, and then save every single calorie for later. This led to some of the earliest forms of food preservation. The most obvious one was the natural freezer. In places with permafrost, you could dig a pit into the frozen ground, and it would stay at a constant, sub-freezing temperature all year round. We've found these meat caches at sites across the Arctic, containing the butchered remains of horses and reindeer. But they also got creative. They would dry meat into jerky, smoke it over their fires to kill bacteria, and render fat into storable cakes. There's even evidence that some groups would sink their kill into cold ponds, using the low temperature and low oxygen of the water to keep the meat fresh for months. They treated the landscape like a giant pantry. They knew exactly which valleys the reindeer would move through in the autumn, and they would be there waiting, not just to eat for the day, but to stock up for the 6 months of darkness ahead. It wasn't just about the physical tools, though. There is a big debate in anthropology about why we, Homo sapiens, survived the last ice age, while our cousins, the Neanderthals, did not. Neanderthals were actually better built for the cold than we were. They were stockier, with shorter limbs and larger noses to warm the air before it hit their lungs. They had been living in Europe for hundreds of thousands of years through multiple ice ages. On paper, They should have won. But when things got really bad, we had a secret weapon that wasn't biological. Our social networks. Neanderthals tended to live in small, isolated family groups. If their local valley ran out of food or their fire went out, they were in trouble. Humans, on the other hand, seem to have maintained massive long-distance social connections. We find seashells hundreds of miles inland and flint from distant mountains in human campsites. This means that if the winter was particularly brutal in one area, a human group could move to a neighbor's territory or trade for resources they didn't have. We used our brains to build a safety net. We didn't just survive as individuals, we survived as a collective. We shared information about where the herds were moving, how to fix a broken needle, and which roots could still be dug out of the frozen ground. Our greatest survival tool wasn't the spear or the fire, it was the story. We told each other how to live. The brain is a heater that runs on information. Even with all the tools and social networks, there were times when the cold was simply too much. This brings us to one of the most controversial and fascinating theories in human evolution. In a cave in Spain called Cima de los Huesos, researchers found the bones of human ancestors from about 400,000 years ago. When they analyzed those bones, they found something strange. The bones showed signs of seasonal damage, the kind of interrupted growth you usually see in animals that hibernate. Now, modern humans definitely don't hibernate. We don't have the biological machinery for it. But some scientists, like Juan Luis Arzuaga and Antonis Bartziocas, have suggested that these early ancestors might have been able to slow their metabolism down during the worst parts of the winter to survive on their fat stores, much like a cave bear. This theory is still hotly debated, and many scientists think the bone damage could be caused by simple malnutrition or disease. But it raises a haunting question. Did we once have a biological off switch for the winter that we eventually traded away for a bigger, more active brain? If we did, it means we chose a path of total technological dependence. We gave up the ability to sleep through the storm so that we could stay awake and figure out how to beat it. It's easy to look back and feel a sense of pity for these people. We see them huddled around a fire in a bone hut, and we think of their lives as nasty, brutish, and short. We imagine them as desperate, shivering shadows. But that's a mistake. They were the peak of human resilience. They saw the worst environment this planet could offer, and they didn't run away. They moved in. They turned the most terrifying animals on Earth into their houses and their clothes. They turned frozen dirt into a pantry. They took the very thing that was trying to kill them, the cold, and they figured out its rules so they could break them. They didn't just survive, they conquered. And they did it with nothing but bone, stone, and the people standing next to them. When you look at the intricate beadwork on those 30,000-year-old parkas, you don't see desperation. You see pride. You see a culture that had so much mastered its environment that it had time to make things beautiful. They weren't just surviving, they were living. The problem is that we've forgotten how they did it. We have spent the last 10,000 years building a world that protects us so well, we've become soft. We think of winter as a season we see through a window, or a reason to buy a slightly thicker sweater. We've outsourced our survival to a power grid that most of us don't understand and couldn't fix if it broke. We've traded the bone needle for a thermostat and the mammoth hut for a drywall box. And in that trade, we've lost something fundamental. We've lost the visceral understanding of what we actually are, a tropical animal in a temporary bubble of heat. We walk around in our climate-controlled lives with the supreme confidence of a species that thinks it has defeated nature. But nature doesn't lose, it just waits. The ice ages aren't a thing of the past, they are a recurring cycle. We are currently living in a brief, warm, interglacial period, a tiny summer in the long, cold year of the Earth's history. Eventually, the cycle will turn. The ice will come back. It always does. And when it does, the power grid won't save us. The thermostat won't turn on. The Amazon packages will stop arriving. Imagine for a second that the lights went out tonight. Not just for a few hours, but for good. Imagine the heat in your walls slowly dissipating, the air in your room turning the same color as the air outside. Your phone is a dead slab of glass. Your car is a cold hunk of metal. You are standing in your living room, and the draft from that window is no longer a minor annoyance. It is a countdown. You look around at your modern life and realize that almost nothing in it can help you. You don't know how to sew a waterproof seam. You don't know how to render tallow into a lamp. You don't know how to build a cold trap entrance or how to track a reindeer across a frozen plain. You have all the knowledge of the internet in your head, but none of the knowledge of the earth in your hands. You are the descendant of the greatest survivors the world has ever known, the product of 100,000 years of successful winter warfare, and yet you might be the first generation in that entire line that wouldn't make it to spring. It's a humbling thought, isn't it? We like to think we're more advanced than the people in the bone huts, but in a real winter, they were the giants, and we are the children. They knew something we've forgotten, that survival isn't a right, it's a skill. It's something you have to earn every single day with your hands and your head. They lived on the edge of the world, and they thrived because they respected the cold. They knew its power, and they met it with a power of their own. We, on the other hand, have tried to ignore it. We've tried to pretend that we've moved past our biology. But that draft in your window is a reminder that the world is still there, and it's still cold. Maybe it's time we started paying attention again. Maybe it's time we looked at those ancient people not as primitives, but as teachers. Because the ice is patient, and one day we might need to remember how to build a house out of giants. Actually, the more you look into this, the more you realize that our current comfort is the anomaly. For 99% of our history, being comfortably warm was a full-time job. It was a constant, grueling effort that required every ounce of our creativity and cooperation. Our ancestors lived in a world where a single rip in a coat or a fire that went out at the wrong time meant the end of a family tree. Every one of us is here because a long line of people, hundreds of generations of them, were smart enough, tough enough, and lucky enough to stay warm. They fought a war against the frost for us, and they won. But victory is never permanent. The earth has its own rhythms, and we are just guests in its brief summer. So, the next time you feel that little chill in the air, don't just turn up the heat. Take a second to feel it. Really feel it. Remember that your body is a tropical machine, and that the only thing keeping you alive in this climate is a very thin, very fragile layer of technology. We aren't the masters of this world. We are just very clever intruders. We are still those hairless, thin-skinned monkeys, and the cold is still out there, waiting for the lights to go out. If you've ever found yourself staring at a fire and feeling a weird, deep sense of peace, now you know why. That's your DNA remembering the only thing that kept the darkness at bay for 1,000 centuries. It's a connection to a past that was much harder, but in some ways, much more honest than our present. If you enjoy diving into these kinds of rabbit holes and looking at the hidden history of how we actually got here, I'd love to have you along for the next one. There are a lot of stories left to tell about the things we've forgotten. But before you go, think about this. The modern world has given us a level of comfort that our ancestors couldn't have imagined, but it has also given us a profound sense of fragility. We live in a castle made of glass and electricity. And the most undeniable cold fact of all is this: your body still doesn't belong in the climate you live in. You are a biological outsider in your own backyard, and the only reason you aren't freezing to death right now is because you're currently standing on the shoulders of people who knew how to turn a mammoth into a home. Without them, and without the thin wires running through your walls, you are just 6 feet of warm meat in a world that is mostly ice. You aren't safe. You're just insulated. And insulation eventually wears thin.